Hello, hello. Welcome back. The next presentation is going to start soon. The title is You Do Not Have to Be Good. Intelligence, Goodness, and the School. It's presented by Siddhartha Menon. Siddhartha is a trustee of the KFI, a former principal of Rishi Valley School, and former director of the Rajat Education Center. He's currently based at the Valley School in Bangalore. He's also an alumnus of Rishi Valley School and has been working in the Krishnamurti school for more than 30 years. So we will have a probably 50 minutes to an hour presentation and then 20 minutes panel discussion and with a Q&A. And then the next presentation will be a panel from the school. Thank you.
So, good afternoon to all of you. Am I audible? Yeah. Yeah? Okay. So, thank you, Francisco, and thank you to the KFI for giving me this space to share something related to the theme. I'd also like to thank, as David did, the many people who've been working behind the scenes to make this event possible. The organizers who thought it through, the tech team, the people who've been giving us these delicious lunches, and several others. So thank you all. The theme I was given was intelligence. And it seems to me, looking at the presentations that we had yesterday, and this morning, that there are several things that run across the various themes that have come up. And perhaps what I would like to see really as being most central to all of them is the theme that Pathik took up explicitly yesterday, which is that of the self. And I think there are many entries into the question of the self. Pathik himself approached it as a scientist, and we saw very minutely how the self operates. Mary came through it through her perspective as an educator, and we also had Connie looking at it in the context of conditioning. And this morning, when David spoke about thought and observation, of course, implicitly again was the place of self in this whole movement of life. My approach is going to be partly through poetry, which is something I've engaged with quite deeply for several years. And I hope that doesn't sound a bit self-indulgent, but I think there are valid reasons for finding an approach to Krishnamurti's vision through poetry. One is that Krishnamurti himself wrote poetry in his younger years, in the 1920s, 1930s. In fact, the last time that I had this opportunity to speak at the KFA gathering 4 years ago, I tried to look at how images in one of Krishnamurti's long poems, The Song of Life, come out later in his more mature discourse as well. And although Krishnamurti ceased to write poetry at a certain stage in his life, he continued to use extremely poetic language. He used metaphor a great deal. And I think that's not surprising because the truths he was speaking of are apparently accessible through a process of reasoning, rationality. At one point, it seems crystal clear what Krishnamurti is speaking about. And then, when you engage with it, you find there are all kinds of paradoxes. And how do you approach these paradoxes? And I think that poetry offers some tools to that. So having said that, the question I'm looking at is intelligence. And as you might have recognized, the title, "You Do Not Have to Be Good," is in fact the opening line of a famous poem by Mary Oliver. And I'll come to that later, but I'm going to begin by looking at a very different kind of poem by D.H. Lawrence called Snake. And the reason I'm doing this is I would like to use these poems as a way of presenting in concrete terms some aspects first of intelligence and then of what we might call goodness. And I think having these as touchstones may help us to also look by way of parallel and contrast at what Krishnamurti was saying about intelligence. So in this poem, Snake, by the English poet D.H. Lawrence, the setting is the 1920s, a hot morning in Sicily, where the poet sees the snake, and he's watching it with intense curiosity. And it's a fairly long poem, and I'm going to take you through parts of it. And we'll try and see the various kinds of intelligence, or possibly unintelligence, that operate through the poem. He reached down from a fissure in the earth wall in the gloom and trailed his yellow-brown slackness soft-bellied down over the edge of the stone trough and rested his throat upon the stone bottom. And where the water had dripped from the tap in a small clearness, he sipped with his straight mouth, softly drank through his straight gums into his slack, long body silently. Someone was before me at my water trough, and I, like a second comer, waiting. What's immediately interesting in this passage is just the closeness of the description. Here you have a mind that's intensely attentive to this creature. A creature, it must be said, that you don't watch perhaps with this kind of close, leisurely attention. A snake is more often something that you move away from or try to drive away. So there's this quality of intense fascination. But then someone was before me at my water trough, and I, like a second comer, waiting. So there's this I that's watching, who seems to feel he's almost being kept to wait by the snake. And quickly a thought process comes in. The voice of my education said to me, he must be killed. For in Sicily the black snakes are innocent, the gold are venomous. And voices in me said, if you were a man, you would take a stick and break him now and finish him off. But must I confess how I liked him? How glad I was he had come like a guest in quiet to drink at my water trough and depart peaceful, pacified, and thankless into the burning bowels of this earth. So you see this play of voices. There's a voice of education which is saying, this is a poisonous snake, it needs to be killed. Another voice, slightly different from the voice of education, that's taunting the speaker. If you were a man, right, you would take a stick. And then this third voice, must I confess how I liked him? how glad I was. Almost a kind of perverse enjoyment of the presence of this dangerous creature. So you have a self in which there are many voices playing out, which is perhaps a not entirely unfamiliar experience. And then he drank enough and lifted his head dreamily as one who has drunken and flickered his tongue like a forked knight on the air, so black seeming to lick his lips, and looked around like a god unseeing into the air, and slowly turned his head, and slowly, very slowly, as if thrice a dream, proceeded to draw his slow length curving round and climb again the broken bank of my wall face. And as he put his head into that dreadful hole, and as he slowly drew up, snake easing his shoulders and entered further, a sort of horror, a sort of protest against his withdrawing into that horrid black hole, deliberately going into the blackness and slowly drawing himself after, overcame me. Now his back was turned. It's strange, the snake is going away. And as the snake is going away, this man is overcome by a feeling of horror at the snake disappearing into this unfathomable darkness. I looked around, I put down my pitcher, I picked up a clumsy log and threw it at the water trough with a clatter. So you have a moment of pure instinct. The snake's going away, it poses no threat to anyone, and at that moment, the speaker throws this log of wood at the snake. And it disappears. As it happens, it doesn't hit the snake. And immediately I regretted it. I thought, how paltry, how vulgar, what a mean act. I despise myself and the voices of my accursed human education. So much for education. And I thought of the albatross, and I wished he would come back, my snake. The albatross is a reference to Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is a poem in which a man, for no reason at all, shoots a bird, and that brings misfortune onto the ship. But anyway, I wished he would come back, my snake. And at the very end, this is how the poem concludes. And so I missed my chance with one of the lords of life, and I have something to expiate a pettiness. Right? So if you see the various things that happen in the course of this poem, there's intense fascination, a quality of deep attention, of appreciation, a moment of connection with nature, in spite of what the voices of education are saying. But there's also a strong sense of I. There's a persona that the poem builds up. There's this I that's watching. There's this I that feels honored that the snake has chosen his water trough to come to. There's the I that is aware of the voices of his education but finally acts instinctually. And at the very end of the poem is left with regrets. Now, if you look at this kind of arc, this movement that happens from appreciation, connection, eventually something being broken irrevocably, that snake is not going to come back, right? And then the regret at the end of it. It's not, as I said earlier, an unfamiliar situation, I think, in our lives. There are many experiences in which this kind of movement seems to happen, of various kinds of things all at once. And so the poem, it seems to me, embodies beautifully a certain way in which our minds act. And at the center of this action is this persona, there's this self, there's this I, right? Through various kinds of intelligence, and you might say unintelligence as well. Now, what, if anything, does this have to say about how Krishnamurti speaks about intelligence? And so, to take this up, I would like to share with you some passages picked up from here and there in which Krishnamurti is speaking about aspects of intelligence. I'm not going to try and analyze them and not going to comment very much on them, but I'd like to just place them on the table, as it were, and then maybe see how they seem to point to something rather different from the implicit intelligence in Lawrence's poem. So here's the first. The awakening of intelligence implies having an insight. By the way, in this and the following quotes, you'll see some words or phrases in italics. Those are my italics. Those are words that I'd like to specially draw attention to. The awakening of intelligence implies having an insight into all our problems, psychological problems, crises, blockages, and so on. The word intelligence, according to a good dictionary, means reading between the lines. And also deeply, its significance is to have deep, true insight, not intellectual comprehension, not resolving the problem through conflict, but having an insight into a human issue. That very insight awakens intelligence. Or having this intelligence, there is the insight both ways. Having an insight involves no conflict, because when you see something very, very clearly, the truth of the matter, there is the end of it. You don't fight against it. You don't try to control it. Now, I'm especially interested in what I've sort of highlighted towards the end. When you see something very, very clearly, the truth of the matter, there is the end of it. Krishnamurti often speaks of seeing, but he speaks of a seeing that acts, and the action is that something ends with the seeing. Yesterday we had one analogy in Pathik's presentation when he spoke about the mirage. Once you see it's a mirage, something ends. But this is, I think, very central to Krishnamurti's discourse, the idea of the connection between seeing and ending. And I'd just like to leave it there for the moment. Intelligence has no evolution. Intelligence is not the product of time. Intelligence is this quality of sensitive awareness of what is. Now, this again will feel familiar even from the presentations that we've had so far. This idea of no evolution. There's no time involved in it. Intelligence is not something that you work towards. It's something which, in Krishnamurti's vision, is there or isn't, and is related to this quality of awareness, which perhaps is parallel to David's observation. You have to have this extraordinary feeling, this sensitivity to everything, to the animal, to the cat that walks across the wall, to the squalor, the dirt, the filth of human beings in poverty, in despair. You have to be sensitive, which is to feel intensely, not in any particular direction, which is not an emotion which comes and goes, but which is to be sensitive with your nerves, with your eyes, with your body, with your ears, with your voice. You have to be sensitive completely all the time. Unless you are so completely sensitive, there's no intelligence. Intelligence comes with sensitivity and observation. Now, so one is the sensitivity to everything, and not in any particular direction. Now, this again I find fascinating, because of course, direction implies a movement towards towards something that you are foreshadowing, something that you are expecting. So a sensitivity that is directionless. Now, what does that mean? Right? A sensitivity that is not choosing, right? Which is just aware of everything. And from sensitivity, he makes the connection with compassion. When one understands the whole nature and movement of the intellect and thought, we can begin to investigate what is intelligence. Intelligence is the capacity to perceive the whole. Intelligence is incapable of dividing the senses, the emotions, the intellect from each other. And I'm moving on, I'm not reading out everything. Without this intelligence, there can be no compassion. Compassion is not the doing of charitable acts or social reform. It is free from sentiment, romanticism, and emotional enthusiasm. It is as strong as death. It is like a great rock. I commented a little while ago that Krishnamurti continued using metaphors, and there's an extraordinary metaphor. Compassion is like a great rock. It also reminded me a little of Mary's reference to Michelangelo's image of the angels that is seen before it's carved out of the stone. Compassion and intelligence walk together, they are not separate. Compassion acts through intelligence, it can never act through the intellect. So Krishnamurti repeatedly makes a distinction between intelligence and the intellect, right? And we'll see this again in a moment. Training the intellect does not result in intelligence. Rather, intelligence comes into being when one acts in perfect harmony, both intellectually and emotionally. There's a vast distinction between intellect and intelligence. Intellect is merely thought functioning independently of emotion. That's so interesting, thought functioning independently of emotion. When intellect, irrespective of emotion, is trained in any particular direction, again this idea of direction, one may have great intellect, but one does not have intelligence. Because in intelligence, there is the inherent capacity to feel as well as to reason. There's security in total intelligence. That intelligence is not yours or mine. It is intelligence. In that there is security. And I'm skipping. So the mind, I love the way he puts this. So the mind naturally, easily, sweetly, without any effort, becomes extraordinarily quiet. In that stillness of mind, there is no time. Yesterday, Connie spoke about stillness, and we'll come back to it in a little while. But I'd like especially to draw your attention to this sentence, that intelligence is not yours or mine. Now, this is one of many counterintuitive things that Krishnamurti seems to say. How can we conceive of an intelligence that is not personal, that does not belong to an individual? And yet he says that, in fact, he says it again here. In being aware of that which is false, there comes intelligence. Intelligence is not yours or mine. It operates when any incident, propaganda, challenge, or demand is put before us. Intelligence is the perception of what is false and what is true. So how does one make sense of this whole business of an intelligence that is not personal? And I think it's here that I would make a central distinction between the way Krishnamurti is speaking of intelligence and the implicit intelligences in the poem that we looked at, D.H. Lawrence's Snake. At the center of that poem is a persona that is built up. It's an interesting persona, which has many, it's what we would call an intelligent, self-aware kind of persona. But there is a persona there. Whereas Krishnamurti seems to be speaking about an intelligence in which there is no self. And I think this is something that we need to sort of get our minds around to make any sense of what it is. In fact, you could even say, I'll make the case for this in a moment, that the antithesis of intelligence in Krishnamurti's use of the word is probably the self, or at least the sense of the self, to borrow Pathik's distinction from yesterday. And here's a question which might seem odd to ask, because the answer one would probably think is self-evident. And I've just jotted down a few points relating to it. Why is intelligence necessary? And I would say, to begin with, without it we proceed in illusion and conflict and spread these. Without it, our personal desires and choices become paramount to the detriment of the world. And as I said a little while ago, the antithesis of intelligence in Krishnamurti's formulation is the self. Now, personal desires and choices, when they become paramount, and that's of course the experience I think that most of us have in the way we live our lives. And that is of course also the source of a lot of the division and therefore the conflict that the world has today. And finally, without it, there's no flowering of goodness. And so this brings me to the second sort of theme I'm looking at parallelly with intelligence, which is that of goodness. I've been interested in what this means quite specifically. I can remember when I started getting interested in it, soon after I joined Rishi Valley School as a teacher, and I was quite young, I was about 24. A senior colleague of mine was being interviewed by students at an assembly, at a school assembly. And one of the questions was, what is it you're most interested in as a teacher? And this person said, I'm really interested in what goodness means as a teacher. And I had never thought of it in those terms. Goodness is one of those words you seem to not think about very much. You take it so much for granted. And I had this kind of aha moment then that, goodness is something that needs to be understood. And I think it's extremely closely related, if not even identical, to this whole intelligence in the way Krishnamurti uses the word, where intelligence, to remind you of what I said a little earlier, seems to be the antithesis of a sense of self. So, well, this is just for fun. I asked a wise man, tell me, sir, in which field could I make a great career? There's a lot of opportunity and very little competition. So anyway, I picked that up from somewhere on the internet. So what is it to be a good human being and to flower in goodness? And before I sort of take that any further, these seem to be almost like parallel phrases. Flowering in goodness, the awakening of intelligence, flowering, awakening. These are both words that suggest natural processes. But I'd like to make a bit of a distinction here. You see, when you talk about something flowering or you talk about something awakening, you would tend to think it's from one state into another. You awaken from sleep into wakefulness, let's say, or a bud flowers into its full bloom. But I think Krishnamurti is using these words in a somewhat different sense. And I think he's using the ing as a sort of continuous present tense. So it's not a flowering from something into something else, but a flowering that's ongoing in the present. And likewise with awakening. It's not an awakening that ends once you've been awakened, but it's an awakening that is continuous. That's how I understand his use of these words. I may be wrong. So what is it to be a good human being? And here let's look at, now this is something I picked up somewhat randomly from the internet. And let's look at it. The concept of flowering of goodness emphasizes the continuous nurturing of positive attributes in everyday life, as advocated by the philosopher Krishnamurti. This idea highlights the importance of personal development that fosters well-being and moral virtue. Through Krishnamurti's teachings, individuals are encouraged to actively cultivate goodness, which leads to invaluable growth and a more virtuous society. Overall, flowering of goodness reflects an essential pursuit of positive personal and communal growth. Now, I'm sure this is well-meaning and it certainly sounds plausible, but it also seems to be a bit like an AI hallucination. So, because Krishnamurti, of course, would deny all of the things that I've put in italics here, right? It's certainly not a conscious nurturing of anything, positive or negative. Krishnamurti is not speaking about the importance of personal development that fosters well-being and moral virtue, however nice that sounds, or encouraging, to actively cultivate, and so on and so forth. So you see, I think we have a lot of notions of goodness, as I said. That's why I'm so interested in this term. But the most obvious and conventional ways of looking at goodness, I think, are things that Krishnamurti would certainly question, if not deny. Because goodness has no motive, because all motive is based on the self. So we come back to that particular elephant in the room, right? The self. And where the self is, there is no intelligence, there is no goodness. It is the egocentric movement of the mind. So what do we mean by goodness? Surely there is goodness only when there is total attention. Attention has no motive. When there is a motive for attention, is there attention? If I pay attention in order to acquire something, the acquisition, whether it be good or bad, is not attention. It is a distraction, a division. There can be goodness only when there is a totality of attention in which there is no effort to be or not to be. Now, this again is sometimes I feel with Krishnamurti, when he puts a statement out there, when there's a totality of attention in which there's no effort to be or not to be, I have mixed ways of looking at it. One part of me wants to make sort of complete rational sense of it. And at one level, that's not difficult. To make logical sense of what Krishnamurti is saying, to contrast it with something that he's not saying, is fairly easy to do. But what does that mean actually in one's life? Because one is so strongly impelled in one's inner sort of world to have a direction, to listen with a motive, to be attentive because there's something you want to be attentive to. And here he is holding out something which has no direction, which has no goal, which has no motive. And he's saying that's where it lies. And I hope at the end of this presentation to to, in some sense, illustrate this, to give body to this, but for now I'd just like to leave it as a statement. So we come because our overall theme is education, so schools and the flowering of goodness. And the real question is, if we are concerned as human beings, as educators, with this question of goodness, and goodness is not something to be cultivated, goodness is something that has no practice that will take you there, how do we address it in schools is a really central question, leave alone in our everyday lives. When the nature of freedom is understood, then you eliminate all competition on the playing field and in the classroom. Is it possible to eliminate academic or ethical comparative? So this is one thing which is central to, I think, the schools that have been inspired by Krishnamurti. To understand competition, to minimize competition, if not eliminate it altogether, to look at what competition does to you and so on. And yet to have excellence. So no competition is not this kind of situation of, well, I'm fine with what I am, I'll just do whatever I can. Krishnamurti is demanding excellence, and I think we need to understand what excellence means in life, in a school, in the absence of competition. Please bear in mind that we are concerned with the flowering of goodness, which cannot possibly be where there is any competition. Another of those very definitive statements. Competition exists where there is comparison, and comparison does not bring about excellence. And the next sentence is, I think, very central. These schools fundamentally exist to help both the student and the teacher to flower in goodness. Right? So this is at the heart of it, is what Krishnamurti is saying. So we cannot afford not to be concerned with this question of goodness if we are interested in education and the significance of life. So the schools have come into being not to turn out mere careerists, but to bring about excellence of spirit. By the way, the whole movement of life is learning is the name of the letters to the schools that David was reading from. And now I'd like to come, the last part of my presentation will look a little bit at education. But before that, I'd like to bring in the second poem that I was referring to, which is Mary Oliver's beautiful poem, Wild Geese, that begins, "You do not have to be good." You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert, repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. It's an extraordinary poem, and there are just 2 or 3 things that I'd like to say about it. One is it begins, you do not have to be good. Now, Krishnamurti, if Krishnamurti had written this poem, might have begun, you cannot try to be good. It's not something that you can achieve. But Mary Oliver is saying much the same thing. This is not something that you need to do as a conscious effort, especially through this whole business of sin and repentance and guilt and all of that. A second thing is this poem is not anthropocentric. It's not primarily about the human experience. It includes the human and the animal experience, and it places them on the same footing. It doesn't privilege human over animal. A third is it's not concerned with individual growth in an exclusive kind of way. Right? Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Eventually, you discover your place, as the poem puts it, in the family of things. And finally, when she says the world is harsh and exciting, I find that a striking phrase. The world is full of things that happen. Not all things that happen are pleasant. They can be harsh in many ways. And yet to retain this sense of excitement, of adventure, through whatever life throws at you, is I think very moving. And I think it's something that's implicit in Krishnamurti's discourse as well. Because he's never urging us to try and make our lives comfortable. And I think he sees that all of life, all of experience is a window into something, towards something that you can learn about yourself and about the world and its problems. So then, to come now to the question of education, I'll be done in a few minutes. And I'm not going to read all of this because some of it overlaps with passages that Mary used yesterday. Now, I think the key thing here is, how do we define significance of life? If we have a certain understanding of that phrase, that will determine the way we see education's connection with it. And I would like to offer the suggestion that it has something to do with the examined life or the attentive life. It was Socrates who said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And I think we've seen how where Krishnamurti places attention. Where there's attention, something happens to the self, something happens to goodness. So I think this is at the heart of it, in my understanding. What is it that nurtures an attentive life? Krishnamurti also speaks about what he calls an integrated outlook on life. And I think that's linked to attention, an attention that's without direction. Because if there's attention to everything, then that is parallel to what you might call an integrated outlook to life. You're not choosing. You're not discriminating between what is worth being attentive to and what is not. And he also says, instead of awakening the integrated intelligence of the individual, education is encouraging him to conform to a pattern, and so is hindering his comprehension of himself as a total process. So, self-understanding, the comprehension of yourself is again, it seems to me, central to Krishnamurti's understanding of what education is for. And this last paragraph, Mary read yesterday, without integration, life becomes a series of conflicts and sorrows. Of what value is it to be trained as lawyers if we perpetuate litigation and so on? Though we may have money or are capable of earning it, though we have our pleasures and our organized religions, we are in endless conflict, right? Which is a fact. So, self-knowledge then, right, which is highlighted in the previous passage about the significance of life. The ignorant man is not the unlearned, but he who does not know himself. Understanding comes only through self-knowledge, which is awareness of one's total psychological process. Thus, education in the true sense is the understanding of oneself, for it is within each of us that the whole of existence is gathered. So this brings together this idea that in understanding yourself, supposedly, it's not yourself you're concerned with, but all of existence. Your psychological processes are no different in the way from anyone else's, as Krishnamurti would have it, and as Mary Oliver has it, you are no different from the natural world. Self-knowledge is freedom. You may know all about the wonders of the earth and of the heavens and still not be free from envy or sorrow. But when you say, I don't know, you are learning. To learn is not to accumulate either knowledge, things, or relationships. To be intelligent is to be simple, but to be simple is extraordinarily arduous. Now that's another fine koan-like statement that Krishnamurti makes, the arduousness of what is simple. So what can a school do? Well, here's one view. The most important thing we ever learn at school is the fact that the most important things can't be learned at school. So should we just close down our schools? Now Haruki Murakami perhaps had reasons for what he had to say, but we don't need to be cynical about schools. Poor things, they're doing their best, even if they don't always get it right. So I would like to just talk very briefly about two things which I think are very important to the experience in the Krishnamurti schools. Just two, because we are short of time and because they connect with my last image that I'd like to share with you. One has to do with silence. And you might remember yesterday Connie spoke about silence, stillness, and spaciousness, and the importance of that in this whole movement of life. And I think the schools in different ways try to create spaces where silence, stillness, and spaciousness are not only available in various ways, but are in some sense nurtured. And I think that's an important part of the experience of being in these schools. And the second thing I'd like to mention very briefly is the place of nature. All of the Krishnamurti schools, and I visited or worked in all of them, are situated in extraordinary surroundings. We just have to look out through the window to know that that's the case. And the question is why? Is it a kind of aesthetic escape from the ugliness of various other things? I don't think so. I think, as David pointed out towards the end of his talk, nature, the connection with nature, responding to the beauty of nature and the integrity of nature becomes like a sort of model for what life can be, even if you don't think about it explicitly in those terms. And therefore, coming into contact with nature is very central, I think, to these schools. And this brings me to the last thing. And I was so happy when David referred at the end of his talk to these passages of description, often of natural surroundings that sort of run through Krishnamurti's books and writings and speech. Because it seems to me that in these passages, you get an experience of intelligence in action, as it were. And I'm going to end this talk by reading one such passage, and it's a well-known passage. There is a tree by the river, and we have been watching it day after day for several weeks when the sun is about to rise. As the sun rises slowly over the horizon, over the trees, this particular tree becomes all of a sudden golden. All the leaves are bright with life, and as you watch it as the hours pass by, that tree, whose name does not matter, What matters is that beautiful tree. An extraordinary quality seems to spread all over the land, over the river. And as the sun rises a little higher, the leaves begin to flutter, to dance. And each hour seems to give to that tree a different quality. Before the sun rises, it has a somber feeling, quiet, far away, full of dignity. And as the day begins, the leaves with the light on them dance and give it that peculiar feeling that one has of great beauty. By midday, its shadow has deepened, and you can sit there protected from the sun, never feeling lonely, with the tree as your companion. As you sit there, there is a relationship of deep, abiding security and a freedom that only trees can know. Towards the evening, when the western skies are lit up by the setting sun, the tree gradually becomes somber, dark, closing in on itself. The sky has become red, yellow, green, but the tree remains quiet, hidden, and is resting for the night. If you establish a relationship with it, then you have relationship with mankind. You're responsible then for that tree and for the trees of the world. But if you have no relationship with the living things on this earth, you may lose whatever relationship you have with humanity, with human beings. As I said, I think this passage and passages like it embody intelligence, as Krishnamurti was speaking about it. You see the quality of attention in action, as it were. So I'll stop there, and this is just a summary. These are the subheadings of whatever I covered, just for your reference, in case you'd like to have it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Siddhartha, for a beautiful presentation. Here we are with Patik, a KFA trustee, and Gianni works a teacher of Grove School. I was thinking, for me personally, the first question that comes is how to talk about intelligence without speculating about something, or what are the aspects maybe that can be discussed in regards to intelligence in the Krishnamurti sense, without going to that other space of, I imagine it's like this. You know? So I don't know if there's anything to answer about that, but that's my concern. I like when one section, it was a very short sentence that you were reading, by a quote by Krishnamurti, where it says, intelligence is to be able to perceive the whole something like that. So, I can go there intellectually even when you study a little bit ecology or life processes. The interconnectedness of it all is very clear, but he's talking about another type of perception, it seems, right? Be able to perceive the whole. What does that mean?
I mean, I've been speaking for the last hour, so maybe somebody else might like to respond to what it means. Yeah.
No, you can't get out of it so easily.
I can't get out of it?
You have to speculate.
I have to speculate. Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to this paradox maybe of perception that isn't from a center that's rooted in your sense of self. Because normally when we look at things, we look at them in relation to ourselves. What are like in the first poem that I was reading from, where there's a strong self that's looking at things, judging things, appreciating things, or being afraid of things, or whatever. And at the very end, in the passage about the tree, you seem to see something quite different at work. You seem to see a connection that happens purely through looking, where the self doesn't seem to matter. Of course, there is, I suppose, a self that's looking, otherwise who is looking? And yet, the thing becomes more important than the you that's looking. And maybe when that happens, there's a greater chance that what is perceived is, if not whole, at least it's not narrowed by your focus, by your interests. Well, that's a tentative response. Yeah.
What do you think, Patik?
Well, let's attack Siddhartha as hard as we can. So take for instance that last passage. Now, there are passages where Krishnaji has written something similar, but then gone on to say, but that's not what we're talking about. When one relies on something like that to produce a silence or a stillness or this thing of one with, he's explicitly said, no, that's not what we're talking about, even though it, on the surface of it seems very appealing. Point number 2, there are many, many situations where one can, by happenstance or intent, reduce even to a point of non-recognition this feeling of a sense of self. It's really quite simple to do that, and that is absolutely not, again, what's being talked about, a relative reduction in that feeling of the self. It's either there or not there. It's one of those absolutes. So it's not that, when I'm full of myself and my ideas and I'm dealing with situations, there's no possibility of a connection, let's say, with that which is not of the self, or intelligence, or goodness, whatever way you want to put it. Then there's the notion that, well, if I wasn't as full of myself, is there more contact? Might there be? Does that open the door? And I think from logic and also from Krishnamurti, the answer is unambiguous, that no. it is not a question of reduction of the sort of, sense of self-importance. That certainly has its place in dealing with oneself and people, but that is not a door or a window or a possibility. So one is really thrown back completely on oneself, and despite the beauty of these passages, despite the experience many of us have had of being in some place extraordinary or being with some person who seems open, unfortunately, that's not it. According to a structure of understanding what the sense of self is and how these different forms are, and if one must invoke Krishnamurti, then there's certainly material in Krishnamurti where he has corrected the impression that he sometimes himself gives in evoking these sorts of situations and making comments like that there was not a single thought, there was silence. But he has at other times, in my view, corrected that and said, no, sorry, that's not what we're talking about when we talk about love or intelligence or beauty. Said that which can be appreciated, that originates from an object, is not beauty in his. Right. So that's what I would say back to you, not to be argumentative or difficult, but that really is.
No, I think that's a necessary caution because, one can romanticize aspects of Krishnamurti's thought, the ones that seem to be more accessible, and think you've got it because they seem to be accessible. And yet, in response to your first point, if you look at the passage which seems to come out of a state of complete attention as a means to something, then yes, I see it's problematic. But if you see it just for what it is, and you don't use it as a sort of stepping stone into something, then I think your relationship with it is different. And for me, personally, as I said, understanding Krishnamurti at a certain level, his logic, and then hearing you speak about it and with great subtlety from a sort of scientific perspective as you did yesterday, I seem to grasp something. And yet I recognize that what I seem to grasp is more a process of the rational mind than something that is so deep that it affects the way I live. So to see something in a way that it ends, we spoke about that also. So I'm there, and I see the limitations of what I see, and yet for me these passages, given that I'm aware that I shouldn't sort of, in some sense, make them aspirational and think that if I can do that there, I'm there. Yet I seem to learn something from them that I do not learn from his analytical passages.
Yes, I want to mention something. You said something about a door, leaving a door or a window open just now. And I just have a short passage from Krishnamurti that I think also might relate to the schools as well, which is something from Menon, 1968, Public Talk 9. He talks about leaving the door open, and he says, all that one can do is to open that door. That door is kept open only when there is order, but not the order of society, which is disorder. And to leave that door open is all that one can do. Whether that reality comes through that door, you can't invite it. And if you are very lucky, by some strange chance, it might come and give its blessing. But but one must work very hard every day to lay the foundation. And that is all that matters, nothing else. Then out of that may come love, beauty, and silence. There is something there about laying the foundation and some kind of work that he's pointing at. That I'm not saying, of course, if I say that's the first step, then I would contradict everything that he has said. The first step is the last step. But so it would be maybe interesting to get to that subtlety of what does it mean to leave the door open versus the door is shut.
Well, I find it quite interesting. I just returned from the 11th grade. We go on a backpacking trip, or a camping trip rather, and we were in Utah in Bryce Canyon. And for anyone who hasn't been there, you get the same sense of scale as if you've ever been to the Grand Canyon, where you get these views as you hike along this canyon that are so immense to sort of take in all at once that it leaves you in a sort of awestruck moment, at least immediately upon it. And I was walking with 2 or 3 students, and we had one student who was very much interested in geology. So when you're there at Bryce Canyon, you can see millions of years of history in the canyon itself. And so we had one student who was just so excited and very much sharing all of the knowledge of, well, do you know why that layer looks white and that layer looks oranger and this layer looks yellow? And they were explaining it to us all and as we were hiking. And then the student finally asked me, they said, well, Gianni, do you have any questions? And I said, yes, there's a question that's really stuck with me. And I think it will, maybe in this way that the door is open, always kind of stick with me, which is why should it, like you've done a great job of explaining it, and we all understand the process of how this came to be, but why should it appear beautiful to us? And we all kind of grew silent and just kind of kept hiking and never really spoke of that question. And the conversation moved on. And about 3 days later, because it's a 9-day trip, so 3 days later, I was around the campfire, and one of the students who was there said, I've been thinking about that question. Why should it appear beautiful to us? We know the reasons of why it looks the way that it does and the magnificent process that happens over all these millions of years. And the student said to me, I wonder if it appears beautiful to us because there is an order that we can see or feel when we look out at it that is much older than us, and that in perceiving that order, in the moment that I first see it, I'm not thinking, how do I fit in to this world? I feel like I am not even there.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Definitely interesting comment.
Yeah.
Yes. I have some questions from the audience online, and then we will come to you if you. The mic is still there, Dean, right? Yeah. So one question from the chat online is, it's more of a personal question, but let's see. What would be a good starting point for someone who has been discovering significant conditioning since childhood in middle age? A starting point.
So somebody in middle age has discovered their own conditioning since
significant
childhood.
Conditioning. Yeah. So what would be a good starting point?
I think, I don't know, I'm not sure how to respond. I would just say that seems like the starting point, isn't it? I mean, if you start discovering your conditioning, and it doesn't matter when it happens, doesn't it begin there? And So maybe the questioner is also asking implicitly, I'm just speculating, what does one do with it? And if that's implied in the question, my response would be just to be attentive to it and to learn as much as one can about it. I don't know that there's anything else one can do with it.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So. Yeah.
To try to leave the door open.
Yeah.
Whatever
Yeah,
that.
that's right. Yeah.
So, if thought is inherently limited and cannot become intelligence, what actually brings about the ending of its dominance? Am I looking at Patik as well? Gianni?
Yes, I mean, I thought I'd get more help out here. Okay. Yeah. Patik, would you like to respond?
I don't know. What was it? If thought is limited,
Is inherently limited and cannot become intelligence, what actually brings the ending of its dominance? Thought. What actually brings the ending of thought?
Or the ending of the dominance of
dominance of thought.
Right.
that precise realization.
That is inherently limited.
Yes, then when that's seen, it gets put in place, the action.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say, Francisco?
Well, I feel that it has to do again with that perception of the whole system, in this case of thought, right? To be able to see that limitation, but I don't know what is the mechanism of that seeing of the whole system. But I feel it's not about any particular content, about trying to grapple with this content and then changing it, but an understanding, if it's not seen, an understanding of how thought operates. Maybe thought itself doing this understanding. That's in order to see its limitation. I wouldn't know how to go about figuring out what's the limits if it's not with the same tool, like thought reaching that edge.
In fact, isn't that one of the points you made yesterday, Patik? That thought has this capacity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
Using itself to see its limits. Yes. Completely.
Yeah.
Right.
And in fact, if there was any hint of a suggestion from you that only some seeing of the whole will see this, I would argue vociferously that again you're invoking some outside place, the whole and all that. That very strategy or suggestion or something is indicative that your thought hasn't seen its limit. Because it's still trying to come up with some, maybe if I couldn't, something could,
By the grace of God.
bring in some other word for that self. But it's exactly the same, and so it needs to fall back.
Yeah, if there are any questions from the public, do you mind if you could get to the mic? Sorry, otherwise people won't be able to hear you.
Just a general question. I kind of missed the earlier part of the talk, but what is Krishnamurti's perspective on reincarnation and the soul?
Okay, thank you.
Well, I don't know a lot about it, but I don't think it's something that Krishnamurti in his public discourse took much interest in. I think he was concerned with the question of can we look at our own lives as we live them? And people did sometimes ask him questions about what happens after death and so on and so forth. And the impression I have is that his general response was that it doesn't matter. I could be wrong, but that's so I don't know, as I said, if in his public discourse, if he spoke very much about things like incarnation or terms like soul or even God for that matter.
I have a question. I think I read somewhere like when Krishnamurti, died on his deathbed, he said, no one understood him, in all these 70 years of something. So, I mean, that I heard that statement was given by him. So, what would you like to say on that?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind taking that up because it's not at all clear that that's what he said. So we've looked at that statement. We have a recording, and it doesn't say nobody understood him. He's talking prior to that about the state of the body. He'd been asked for the last couple of days where things are at. There had been some suggestions made that the body may not be any more capable of expressing the teachings, for want of a better word, because there'd been a lot of pain, suffering, morphine, a blood transfusion, things like that. And he was responding in part to that earlier the previous day, that morning, and when that statement was made, to some very specific people who were questioning that, those around him. And that statement was specific about the body, if you look at it. And it makes certain statements, this is prepared and so on. And then he says, don't anybody pretend they've understood. They don't have a clue about it. Is that about the teachings, or is that about what he's just been talking about, which was the state of the body and what it's been through? There's also been, in fact, recently I looked at this because, at least in my personal view, by the way, I'm not speaking here, for the organization or the foundation. I'm just expressing whatever my personal views are, because as a foundation, we don't have a statement on this. So don't hear me as saying this is the KFA position. We looked into this, in fact, with some colleagues who have our archives very recently, and some of the people in this room were part of those discussions. And we looked at every single narrative that has been provided by people who were there. And several of them have written. And there's only one person whose narrative says that this was Krishnamurti's statement for the world. And that too, he's frank enough to say this was in his view. So he says, in my view, I was absolutely clear that this was something Krishnamurti was saying to the world, as a sort of final statement. Nobody else has said that. 2 or 3 of the others said that this seems to be a very context-driven thing about certain things that were being discussed. And it is correct that he asked for that to be recorded, but it's possible that that was to clear it up among those 10 or 15 or 20 people, that there's no ambiguity, that there is no person who then later starts saying, Krishnaji told me to carry on the work and this and that and all that nonsense that he...
May I add a follow-up question?
I'm not quite, done. So I emphatically feel personally that there's a massive amount of misinterpretation and so on around that. Now, I'm not saying that there were people who understood, but that statement in that context and in the light of what he'd just been asked, goodness, it's a huge stretch to say that this is what it meant. I don't see it that way, but yeah, thank you. I'm done now.
Just follow-up question, like he said, the consciousness that which he had it, in his body. It will take like another 100 years. Somebody will again have this consciousness in his body to receive that kind of intelligence, or so that kind of. What would you like to say on that?
He certainly referred to the body and said that they don't know, don't anybody pretend. It takes quite a bit to have such a body, and that's part of the statement. But he's also said in many places, not just here, that in his view, for want of a better word, I don't know what other word to use than view, that a particular set of things that precede some sort of realization are not some inevitable steps or path. He was asked over and over again about these experiences he had under that tree at the east end, and all the rest of that. And he was very clear repeatedly and consistently that that does not have to be the case. He said, if you ask me, I'm sort of willing to talk about it reluctantly, but I can emphatically say to you that that doesn't have to be a sort of necessary condition or conditions for coming to some sort of bigger or wider understanding or realization. In fact, one of the things he said often was some phrase that goes like, well, Columbus had to go on a long journey to discover America, you can catch a flight. No, literally, he said that several times. Columbus, struggled and navigated and landed up, he discovered America, but surely if you want to go there, buy an airline ticket. So that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We're getting close to the end. In 5-7 minutes, we will have a. Oh, you have a question? Yeah. Okay. Come. Last one.
In yesterday's talk at the Grove, Krishnamurti said something very interesting. He said, education is not here to prepare the human beings for the society, nor is it here to educate the individual, but something way beyond that, to create a human being that is totally different. So my question is, and he said, we are trying to do it and we will do it. So my question is, do you have the impression that this is happening in the schools, or did it happen? And if not, what are you planning to do? Because that seems to be the final intent he had about the schools. And if you don't mind, if I can quickly say something about the question about reincarnation. I read that Krishnamurti once said, when he was asked what you think about reincarnation, he said, I don't believe it, but it is a fact.
Thank you. Thank you. Regarding the question about education and schools, that's the perfect question for the next panel, which will be with Jody Grass, the principal of the school. Starting
can I respond?
Yeah, and it will start in 7 minutes, but
I'll take just 1 minute. Yeah. And it's actually linked to the previous question as well, which was about did Krishnamurti feel anybody had got it or not. Towards the end of his life, Krishnamurti asked very searching questions of teachers in the schools, and I think he did so all through, but especially towards the end, including during his last visit to India in 1985, a couple of months before he died. There are these conversations with teachers where he keeps asking insistently, what are you doing in the schools? How come the schools have not done what they are setting out to do? So somewhere Krishnamurti himself seemed to feel that the schools were falling short, and he kept insistently making that demand. But then this whole, if you look at the purpose of schools being, and there are many different things, but one is a place where students and teachers can together flower in goodness, and you ask, is that happening? I can't honestly say yes. But there isn't time now to sort of go into what is happening and why it isn't happening the way Krishnamurti envisaged. But I think, as Francisco said, this might underlie the coming session, so maybe I should stop there.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, see you in 7 minutes. We will be back. Thank you.
Thank you.